As you know, we're here to talk about kind of the national plastics supply chain, and particularly how it applies to automotive materials and automotive fluids. So as a bit of background, that the National Used Oil Management Associations across Canada commissioned the study you are about to hear about in response to changing worldwide recycled plastic markets, and to stay on top of current trends in automotive fluids packaging. To date, we have been fortunate that most automotive plastic containers are made out of a single type of plastic and are therefore relatively simple to recycle compared to mixed plastic materials. New and innovative packaging may provide market benefits, but also have the potential to introduce different materials into our recycling stream, which may complicate the recycling programs. For our webinar, please submit any questions you have using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's right next to the chat feature. Of course, if you do use chat, we'll have a check on that too, but the Q&A stuff will be logged separately and it'll be easier for us to organize. So if throughout DesRosiers' presentation you have any questions, type them in, we'll save them, and then we'll have a dedicated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So hold on to when they're done, and that's where we'll get the discussion and the back and forth. Thanks again for your time, and I will now pass things over to Daniel Azaroff and Martin Stanjek of DesRosiers Automotive Consultants. Gentlemen.
Hello. Thank you for letting us present today. We hope you're all doing well and that you'll find this information to be useful. I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you can all see that. That's going to have the relevant slides on it. I'll start with a brief introduction as well. So we at DSC were tasked to do this study on behalf of UOMA, thanks to our extensive automotive industry experience and the contacts we've established over the years. The Canadian government has been taking steps in recent years to respond to the global challenge of single-use plastics, due in part to their impact on specific ecologies and the environment overall. The automotive industry obviously makes extensive use of plastics, especially for the packaging and transportation of automotive-related fluids, such as oil, coolant, windshield washer fluid, appearance products, and many others. For the purposes of better understanding these concerns and the industry-specific responses to them, DSC's leaned on its experience in the automotive space to combine our expertise with the input of key stakeholders. Generally, we interviewed individuals in three categories: manufacturers or fillers of automotive fluids, packaging manufacturers, as well as recyclers. The following was assembled thanks to their extensive input on these issues as they understood them. So we'll start with a general Canadian market overview, discuss the relevant trends, and provide some context for the study. I find it's best to address the elephant in the room right at the beginning so we can talk about COVID and its impact on, in this case specifically, new light vehicle sales. So we've had a strong decade in terms of new light vehicle sales, with sales rising following 2008-2009 and reaching a peak in 2017. Although sales have decreased slightly since 2017, they remain very high. This year, in particular, started out fairly promising with single-digit increases, typical percent change figures that you'd expect in a typical year. Of course, this quickly changed as the pandemic started in earnest and various government responses took effect, with a very large sales decrease in March, followed by a dramatic decrease in April. In fact, April sales volumes were actually more consistent with what we would expect to find in roughly the early 1950s. Then sales figures began to bounce back fairly quickly in the summer, entering the realm of what could be considered normal. Not shown on this chart, but September sales actually increased over the previous year, with an increase of just over 2%. And October recorded a decrease of just over 2%. However, both of these values are consistent with what a typical year would bring, a sense of normality in a way. But at this rate, the year is expected to close out fairly well under 2019 overall, with spring performance proving difficult to overcome. Now, with these decreases, a lot of speculation started about the upcoming and lingering effects on the automotive market overall. Here we can see Google mobility data showing basically where people were going in those months compared to baseline. The big outlier that you see there is mobility to parks, I believe. You can also take note of the fact that people were going to transit stations less frequently than, for example, to workplaces. Now, if you tie this data in with gasoline consumption figures, It paints a picture that people in Canada have not reduced their driving by as much as could be expected given the extreme circumstances, with, for example, driving to parks and residential destinations partially offsetting losses elsewhere. Although, of course, there is still a significant decrease in driving overall in this period. However, important to note that these figures have stabilized further in recent months. So if people are still driving a fair amount, it can be expected that they're also falling into the standard vehicle ownership requirements. Principally, people are still maintaining their vehicles, getting oil changes, etc. And the time component of a lot of routine maintenance affects this as well. So we'll discuss the oil and coolant markets more later on. Martin, if you'd like to continue.
Thanks, Daniel. So this slide kind of shows the growth of the Canadian vehicle fleet over the past decade, which has been a very good and positive decade for the Canadian market. This is the fleet size obviously is one of the most important factors in terms of demand for oil, coolant, windshield washer fluid, all the automotive related fluids. So the amount of driving in the economy, of course, is a main factor, but the size of the fleet is of equal importance. The following decade, in the future, we expect slightly slower growth than what we've had in the last decade. And this is mostly because of lingering effects of the COVID-induced recession, as well as the total kind of debt load on the Canadian economy, where we've seen rising levels of debt, both at the government, corporate debt, and personal debt levels. In terms of the fleet composition between different regions and provinces in Canada, we see here that we've enjoyed very strong growth in Ontario as well as Western provinces, with both BC and Alberta growth outpacing the Canadian average. This just basically shows the importance of this entire sector and the importance of what we're going to talk about today in terms of the plastics industry, how it remains and will remain relevant in the future. Now, the average age of vehicles in Canada has been on a tear in terms of the increase. This is partially due to just the growth of the Canadian fleet with and the lengthening of the lifespan of the average vehicle with improvements in quality and reliability of vehicles, and also increases in vehicle value. So basically, vehicles that are involved in accidents are less likely to be scrapped when they have a higher value. Of course, these value increases are related to the improved reliability and durability of vehicles. In terms of the composition of the fleet by fuel type, of course, everybody is thinking of battery electric vehicles as they will have a significant impact in the long term on automotive fluids. We know that oil changes will become obsolete as these vehicles hit the road. Coolant changes will most likely decrease drastically, even though the vehicles do use some cooling fluids. However, we can expect a large decline in the use of various automotive fluids as battery electric vehicles become more popular. Currently, obviously, they are just a tiny little speck on the back of the elephant, comprising just 0.2% of the total fleet. Now, hybrids and plug-in hybrids are slightly more popular because they've been in the market much longer, especially hybrid vehicles, comprising just over 1% of the fleet now. However, their impact on the fluids market is minimal, as both these types of vehicles contain an internal combustion engine, which requires the same or almost the same level of maintenance as a traditional internal combustion car. Diesels, of course, are kind of a steady factor in the Canadian fleet, with mostly commercial use vehicles utilizing diesel, and we forecast that to kind of remain that way. The longer term forecast for electric vehicles, of course, there's many opinions on the subject. We have come up with kind of 3 different scenarios, and even in our most optimistic scenario for electric vehicle adoption in Canada, because of the longevity of traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, we forecast that by 2040, we'll have a maximum of about 20% EV penetration in the market, in the fleet. And more likely that the penetration is going to be around 10%. That's kind of our most likely scenario, is about a 10% penetration by 2040. These numbers may seem low, but they're just a reflection of the relatively slow turnover of vehicles in the fleet because of how long traditional vehicles last. We'll now move on to the market size for oil and coolant being the 2 most popular and highest volume fluids used in traditional vehicles. So with COVID-19, of course, the oil market took a hit this year. However, it's been plateauing for a number of years with fairly slow growth. The reason for this fairly slow growth is that maintenance intervals for new vehicles have been extending year over year, and more vehicles are also equipped with oil monitoring built into the vehicle. This oil monitoring basically allows the driver to drive to extend their drain intervals for oil, and this causes kind of the plateauing of the market. There's also the effect of aging, basically demographics, where more and more people are keeping their vehicles into retirement age. So even though vehicle numbers grow, the average miles or kilometers driven per vehicle are actually not growing and are actually shrinking slowly. So post COVID-19 effect, we do expect the market to rebound, but this is not going to be a strong growth kind of scenario in the future. In terms of the regional split of this market, we see British Columbia as the 3rd largest market for oil in Canada, after Ontario and Quebec. On the coolant side, we had a slightly different dynamic playing out recently. The coolant market has basically been shrinking slightly for a number of years. And this shrinkage is related to mostly technology changes, improvements in the quality of coolants and of engines being adapted to utilize long life coolants. So these coolants have allowed much extended drain intervals, especially on the light duty vehicle side. And both of these charts that we presented here are for coolant and oil are light duty vehicles only. In terms of the coolant market size, again, we see Alberta and BC being of similar size and slightly smaller than the markets in the east. We believe that the automotive coolant market will continue to decline into the future as vehicles utilize more and more long life coolants. We can now proceed to the findings of our national survey. And the survey that we've been conducting here with fillers, package manufacturers, and recyclers, the 3 main stakeholders in this project. So the vast majority of packaging that we see the fillers using is purchased from outside suppliers, including those in Canada, Europe, and the US, mostly very large companies. There is a case that there is some fillers still used inside manufacturing. However, it is for a very, very small portion of the total supply of automotive fluids. In terms of packaging types, of course, everybody uses HDPE-based plastic containers. However, other methods of distribution are also very popular, such as especially bulk distribution of these automotive fluids. So direct tanker delivery, plastic totes and steel drums were mentioned by about 2/3 of the respondents, steel kegs as well. And of course, about 1/3 of the respondents also mentioned new types of packaging, such as plastic-lined cardboard, which was also described as the eco box. Now, packaging decisions in terms of the fillers, in very many cases were made in the U.S. head offices of these companies. Canadian head offices have some input into the decision making. However, because Canada is a much smaller market than the US, their influence is very, very small on the decisions made mostly outside of Canada. Their decisions are also made very much based on customer demands and competitive pressure. But again, the US market kind of taking precedence over the Canadian market. In terms of the packaging manufacturers that we have talked to, they were, in all cases, they were very large global companies. It is very hard, I think there's a lot of competition in this market, and it's very hard for small manufacturers to remain competitive in an industry that thrives on very high volume and enjoys very low margins. And the industry overall is dominated by food packaging. So most of these companies, the bulk of their business is food business, and some of these companies even stated that their automotive business is less than 1% of their total business volume. In terms of what they're capable of, in terms of using new materials and new packaging, they all mentioned that they would be very much capable of using other types of reusable packaging, that there's products in development in the pipeline that may be reusable. However, they're not price competitive at the moment. And because of the huge cost pressures within this industry and very low margins, the switch would take place only as a result of regulation rather than economics. In terms of our survey of recyclers, the recycling of these containers is very much influenced by financial incentives. So with programs in place to recycle, to encourage the recycling of automotive fluids containers, those that have a program in place basically have a much higher recycling rate than other types of containers. We've heard specifically mentioned, for example, windshield washer fluid containers, where those containers do not have an incentive, a financial incentive to recycle them. And many of recyclers told us that they do take them in, however, more as a kind of courtesy to their customers rather than any kind of financial gain from doing so. So this industry is basically driven by regulation and by financial incentives introduced at the point of sale to put money on these packages so that they are being taken care of by the recyclers. In terms of the current incentive structure, the biggest issue that we found that the recyclers had is that the reuse of bulk containers is very much constrained by transportation costs. And these costs are often too much of a burden in order to encourage the reuse of existing bulk containers. So the effect has been that a lot of these containers are languishing in storage in various places across Canada. So it's definitely, the incentive structure there has to be modified in order to improve the reusability of these containers, which basically just need processing, which is a very common and well-known technological process in order to reuse these containers. So in terms of the incentive structures for recycling of retail containers, or smaller basically type of containers, again, those incentive structures are insufficient to deal with new materials coming into the mix. So specifically mentioned, of course, were the eco boxes and the Tetra Pak type of containers that combine cardboard and various types of foil or plastic into the container. What the recyclers mentioned is that the current deposit rates, or basically the current financial incentives that are put on these containers, are insufficient to develop the technologies needed in order to deal with these containers in the long run. In terms of the conclusions, there are some key findings that we have looked at. In terms of on the filler side, what the fillers are dealing with is huge product proliferation problem. This is especially apparent on the oil side, where 25 years ago you could cover about 90% of the oil requirements of the Canadian fleet with 3 different products. Currently, the situation is that you need at least 20 different products to cover 90% of the fleet. This is mostly because of the OEM, the trend of the OEM manufacturers, engine manufacturers, using different approaches in order to improve fuel efficiency and in order to improve emissions, especially on vehicles. So as the approaches vary, OEMs are finding they need very, very specific oil formulations. And that's how we have come to this issue of massive product proliferation, where it's difficult for the fillers to switch the industry over to more bulk distribution. Some of these types of oils are just too low volume in order to justify bulk distribution. Similar type of issue is on the coolant side, to a lesser extent, of course, but there's still more different coolant formulations for today's engines than we had a number of years ago. Another issue, of course, another trend that we've uncovered is that new and unrecyclable, currently unrecyclable materials are showing up in retail automotive fluids packaging. I've already mentioned the plastic bladder in the box and the Tetra Paks, and those are the 2 key two key types of containers that are presenting issues to the recyclers. Again, just to reinforce, the incentive structures for the recyclers to recycle bulk packaging, to reuse bulk packaging, are insufficient currently to deal with the packaging in the pipeline. In the bulk packaging, the way that market works is that it's worth basically cleaning and reusing those types of packages, as long as the cost of a new container is higher than the reusing the old one. And of course, in recent years, with the fall in oil prices, we have seen plastics raw material prices also fall. And this induces the fillers to use more, basically find it more cost efficient to use more virgin plastic rather than plastic from the recyclers. The solutions we have tried to think of when looking at these problems, it mostly have to do with, obviously we have to drive the market in the correct direction in terms of dealing with kind of the cradle to grave aspects of the packaging industry. So what we have identified as a solution is to introduce financial incentives to aid in the transport, cleaning, and reuse of bulk packaging. This is very important because bulk packaging, we do see fillers leaning on more bulk packaging in order to distribute their products in a more ecological way. However, if that bulk packaging ends up in the landfill, obviously this isn't a sustainable solution. So there needs to be an incentive structure provided to reuse that bulk packaging and help with the high cost of transportation. Now, in terms of the retail packaging issues, we would suggest to adjust the retail packaging recycling fees in order to better reflect the costs of collection and recycling of each type of container. This taking material types into consideration, not just the size of the packaging. As new materials come into play, of course, there will need to be a development of new technologies to deal with those materials, and there needs to be a financial incentive in order to spur the development of these technologies. Another solution that we have put forward is to establish some kind of approval process for new packaging types. And this is in order to assess the incentive structure needed to make sure that high rates of reuse or recycling are possible for the new packaging types being introduced into the marketplace. We are looking forward to any questions that you might have on the slides that I've presented.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin and Daniel, for your presentation. We have a few questions keyed up here, not a whole lot. So if there's anybody listening that that does have a question in the back of their mind, please type it in, and then we will definitely be able to get back to it. So the first question refers to the initial charts when you're looking at the Canadian vehicle fleet. So can you just go into a tiny bit more detail about what sorts of vehicles are included in those figures and what kind of vehicles aren't?
Yes, so our charts included all vehicles, all light duty vehicles. So those are basically vehicles that are passenger cars and class 1 and 2 light trucks. So basically vehicles under 10,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight rating. Medium and heavy duty vehicles are a much smaller part of the fleet. However, of course, they are used more for commercial purposes. So their use of automotive fluids is outsized compared to the size of the heavy duty fleet.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of explains from a Saskatchewan perspective why our oil numbers are so low, because our particular program relies on a lot of ag equipment and mining equipment for our volumes, right? So yeah, it just kind of specify that it's personal use, basically personal use vehicles, right?
Yeah, basically light duty vehicles. So it does not include any off-road equipment at all.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And then the next question comes from Jean in Quebec, just looking for maybe a bit more information about the percentage of the market that the eco boxes and the pouches take up compared to the HDPE plastic. Did you get any sense as to how much of a market those two kind of emerging and products represented in Canada right now?
So the feeling we got from the fillers is that they're still quite a small percentage of the total market. In terms of the eco boxes, they specifically mentioned, the filler specifically mentioned that they're more used for the transmission oils and axle oils type of application rather than motor oil. So these would be, again, lower volume products. So this type of packaging is definitely under 5% in terms of volume in the Canadian marketplace.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And then just to follow up about what cutoff you used for the bulk packaging, like what container size did you use to define it? In our regulation, it's 50 liters or more. Is that the same cutoff you used?
Yes, yes. For the purpose of this research study, that's the same we have used. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're just whipping through these questions again. If there's any questions that do come up, please type them in. So looking at the product proliferation numbers, when you said there's a lot more products being on the market to cover most of it, can you just clarify, like, are there, you said that about 3 products covered most of it about 10 years ago and 20 products covered it at this point. Is it, are there any particular manufacturers? Can you confirm those numbers first of all? And then are there any particular OEM manufacturers that are kind of causing the proliferation to occur? Like, can we blame Ford or GM, or is it kind of industry-wide?
I would say it's definitely industry-wide. Obviously, there are some manufacturers that have that produce a large number of vehicles, like GM, Toyota, Ford, and so on. So when they come up with a new product with a new motor oil formulation, it kind of automatically swings the whole market that way. However, we have seen, for example, niche, brands like Fiat from FCA. These engines that Fiat is using are coming from Europe, and they use a slightly different motor oil formulation than other major manufacturers. We have seen, for example, just in the recent couple of years, Toyota introduced a new 0W16 motor oil for their engines. For example, the new Toyota Camry uses that formulation. So obviously, Toyota being a large manufacturer, obviously this new formulation is going to grow in terms of market penetration. But we see every manufacturer, whether large or small, use their own kind of very specific formulation. Another example might be, Volkswagen, where even though they use the same viscosity oils as many other domestic or Japanese manufacturers, they use a very specific standard that their oils have to meet, and it is basically makes for a more expensive oil. And the oil fillers don't want to boost oil costs for everybody else in order to meet that one standard, so they make a separate oil to service some of the German makes.
Okay,
so, I would just add that it's an industry-wide problem with every vehicle manufacturer kind of taking their own specific route to introduce new products in terms of oil.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. It kind of touches on something, a question that I had just about whether or not these many different products are going to reach a critical mass that allows them to be distributed in bulk. But it kind of seems like the trend is going the other way, that we're probably going to get more rather than reach that kind of critical mass.
I mean, definitely some of these products will reach critical mass in order to qualify for bulk distribution. However, there are still many others that will not.
Okay, thank you. Have you considered the recent announcement that Quebec is going to ban new vehicle sales of light internal combustion engines starting in 2035, and I think there's something similar in BC. Have those announcements been factored into your projections?
The most recent Quebec projection was not factored into our projections. However, even with this announcement, we don't think our projections are out of line in terms of they will probably now fall somewhere in between the most likely and the high scenario. So basically, we still think that our high scenario is kind of the top end of projections in terms of the EVs on the road. This is basically as a result that banning vehicle sales of ICE vehicles doesn't mean that everybody switches over immediately to an electric vehicle. It just basically means that new vehicle purchases will be 100% ZEVs. So this might include a mixture of electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, as well as hydrogen vehicles. However, we don't think any of these announcements will cause the EV adoption rate to basically accelerate much higher than in their high-end projection. And this has, I mean, there's a lot of other factors at play, such as infrastructure for EV vehicles. There's many other factors that cannot be overcome. Even economies of scale take time to develop. And so this switch over into new type of transportation paradigm will take quite a few years to take hold.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to move down to a question about the challenges and the market size. So I'm just going to read it out. You talk a lot about the challenges with the different materials and insufficient markets for recycling. Did you look at solutions or working with the manufacturers specifically? Was there an appetite for kind of PCR post-consumer, I think that's post-consumer requirements or other regulatory structures? And I may have that PCR acronym mixed up there, but what sort of like kind of regulatory structure do you think might address these challenges?
So in terms of what we heard from fillers and from the packaging manufacturers is that they're not generally in favor of more regulation. They basically increased levels of regulation cause some friction in terms of having to adapt to new ways of doing business, which everybody tries to avoid in order to increase their profitability. However, on the recycler side, of course, the recyclers are very much in favor of a more fair kind of incentive structure in order to spur the development, basically in order to fund the development of new technologies, both in terms of recyclability of existing new types of materials, and in terms of the development of the industry in new directions, in terms of reusability of existing packaging.
Okay, excellent. And then kind of a follow-up, I guess, a related question. Did you, and I think I know the answer to this question because I saw the proposal, but did you look at any jurisdictions outside of North America for use of financial incentives to drive that bulk packaging reuse, or are you aware of any other jurisdictions that have a system in place for that bulk 50-liter plus container?
So although this is not specifically something that we've researched, we have heard from various players in the industry that, for example, developing countries have a higher bulk distribution, where, for example, customers come in with their own container that they found they can reuse and purchase certain fluids in bulk, fluids like motor oil. So they basically purchase it into their own container from a bulk container that's at the retailer. So this is not completely out of the ordinary. and there are countries that where those things happen. However, this is mostly driven by extreme cost consciousness on the part of the consumer. That this is basically the retailer can offer bulk packaged fluids at a lower cost than retail packaged fluids. And when every penny counts, this is the way the market goes. However, I don't think this isn't going to happen by itself within the market like North America. There needs to be an additional financial incentive.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the last question I've got keyed up here. And of course, there's a last call for anyone who has anything else to add for questions. But since you were hired by the used oil management associations, and I appreciate that as a consultant, you didn't put recommendations for next steps in your report. And now this question is, well, what do you recommend as a next step? What do you think a good way to proceed from this point in order to start to answer some of those questions or further evaluate your recommendations? What's your recommended next step?
So we believe that there needs to be a developed a kind of an approval, or like a kind of a board in terms of approving new packaging types in the Canadian market. We do realize that the Canadian market is a fairly small market compared to the US, and a lot of fillers will want to consolidate their packaging types with what is offered in the US. However, we do think there is room in Canada to create a kind of an approval board that will kind of set the pricing and the incentive structures that are necessary in the marketplace in order to develop more bulk packaging, more reuse of the bulk packaging, and more new technologies, new recycling technologies. So there's definitely room for discussion between the key stakeholders. So there needs to be a structure where the three different types of stakeholders can come together and kind of hash out what is the best approach to this. And we do recommend that certain types of financial incentives need to be introduced, new financial incentives need to be introduced in order to keep the ball rolling forward on this kind of cradle to grave issue of plastics.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I've exhausted my list of questions here. So since nothing else is popping up, I'd just like to thank Martin and Daniel for their time and for their presentation. And of course, I want to remind everybody that the full report is available currently on the BC Used Oil Management Association website. And at some point, a recording of this webinar will be made available, probably also through a link on the BC UOMA website. So thank you very much. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.